Anyway, we are officially recording now, and this is a dear friend of mine, Michael.Cates, who we're going to welcome to. I don't even know if we've titled the show, Michael. So if you have an idea of what we should call this, I'm also open to discussing that today.
Yeah.
But anyway, so today we're going to talk about just some of your basic advice for people who are thinking about buying or selling, maybe trying to get an investment property. For people who don't know you, you're a financial planner. I would absolutely love for you to kind of introduce yourself and just tell people a little about what you do, how you got into it, and I'll ask you a bunch of questions about all the more relevant stuff after that.
Oh, sounds great. Well, and thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. And so a little bit about me. I've been in this business, financial planning and wealth management, for about 6 years now, with a team of experienced advisors at UBS Financial. Really enjoyed it, and lucky enough to find what I love doing at an early age. Before that, I had no idea I was going to be going into this. My background was actually in biochemistry. So for me,
I
that
forgot
was
that.
quite a 180. Yeah.
I totally forgot that. Thank you for reminding me.
Yeah. But
What made you get out of that? I forgot. Tell us about
yeah. So, originally I was thinking I'll just keep as many options open as possible because I didn't really know what I wanted to be when I grew up. And so I figured, okay, biochemistry sounds good. I liked science in high school. Let's keep going with that. And ended up working in a couple breweries before that in the microbiology labs, but got to the point where I was like, I'm not really cut out for a PhD program. That's not really what floats my boat. So I started looking around at everything, and luckily enough, I had family in the business to come kind of check out and learn a little bit more about this career. It's basically you can go as far down deep any rabbit holes on information and how you want to run this business and work with your clients to your heart's delight, right? So it keeps it interesting. But I think what really helped me gravitate more towards this was just long-term relationships with people. And that's not necessarily something I knew I wanted coming out of college. But once I found it in this career, there was really no looking back for me. So
Yeah,
that's what keeps me going.
that's awesome. And I know that's one of the things I've appreciated about you over the last few years, is just your ability to do that and maintain those relationships. So for anyone who's interested in that type of work, I think Michael's a great example of kind of how to do it, right? And so,
Thank you.
just curious, man. So just explain a little bit more about what a financial planner does, right? Because I think that maybe some of the people who are going to listen to this might not need one yet. So just tell people a little bit more about what you do, maybe the difference between a planner and a manager, and maybe some of the specific insights that you have kind of from your seat that people who aren't as familiar with what you do and how people like you do it would typically be able to offer for their clients.
Yeah, I think it's never too early to at least consult with a financial planner in some capacity. Now, the extent to which all people need our services is going to vary greatly, right? Some people are talking to us weekly. Some might be more of, hey, I'm thinking about starting up a Roth. I've got, a match with my 401k, whatever that happens to look like. I don't, maybe they don't understand it because this is the first time they're going through it. It's nice to have somebody just walk you through it, right? And that can be a pretty straightforward engagement. You don't necessarily need somebody managing all your funds by any means. But when things become more complex, when you just have accumulated more assets, or maybe you've inherited something from family, and you want to have different efficiencies, whether that's what kind of accounts do I open, what do I invest in, how do I diversify, how much do I actually need to attain these long-term goals that I have, and how do I balance that with short-term living life, right? Because what we always talk about is yes, it's important to save for the long term, but nobody's guaranteed tomorrow. So how do we have and enjoy life now and plan for the future at the same time, right? So it can be bigger conversations like that. Usually what we really emphasize is, and we kind of just put our clients on a regular contact system. So at least quarterly we're talking with them. And people tend to like that, and even want more contact after that, because I want to know if you're buying a car. I want to know if you're thinking about buying a house, if you're going to gift to children or family members or whomever, right? if there's anything that's going on in your life, odds are money is tied to it, right? And it's good for your financial consultant, however you view that person, to be aware of it. Otherwise, why have them in your life, right? If
Totally.
you're not going to use them. So yeah, it's people living in this world of financial planning, keeping up to date on what laws and regulations are changing, what opportunities are out there, doing different valuations. So even things like life insurance, long-term care insurance, disability, making sure there's no major gaps that somebody is missing and taking more risk in some aspect than they should be.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And I love your transition about, or what your comment about enjoying life now and also planning for the future. And I think that brings me in kind of my first question I have for you, that I think would be most relevant for people listening to this or watching it. And that's, so let's say you have a client who approaches you and they're trying to decide whether or not it's time to buy a house, right? So they're currently renting, whether it's an apartment or a home or whatever, right? They've, let's say, missed it, or they were willing to buy over the last few years because of rates, wherever they were, and now they're higher. And so now they're just maybe in the spot where, like, they know they would really get a lot of utility out of buying a house, right? But it's also a lot more expensive than it was, in recent memory. So before we get into kind of some of the tactics and things that people should be thinking about in terms of down payments and saving and all that kind of stuff, like, how would you help a client just evaluate, buying versus renting or selling into something else? Like, how do you think about that for people?
I think it really depends on what their long-term goal is. If they want to be in an area for, I'd say, at least 5 to 10 years, it could make a lot of sense to, even though buying a house is more expensive than it was, odds are it'll be more expensive later, right? And the point of that isn't necessarily what do I think the markets are going to do, because who knows what the markets are going to do, right?
Yeah.
But you can't time it, is the point, right? So you got to do it for the right reasons. One, can you afford the monthly mortgage payment? If there's mortgage insurance, if there, the taxes that are going to be on that, the upkeep on the house. I think the main thing is you just want to make sure you're not going to make yourself house poor, because there is a lot of flexibility in renting, right?
Yeah.
You call the maintenance crew, they come, they fix it, they're responsible for it, right? If your furnace goes out, if the AC goes out, whatever. So it's not just about the down payment. It's, can I afford to stay in the house, right, and maintain the house? And if the answer to those is yes, and you plan to be in a spot for a significant amount of time, I think there's no reason to wait, right?
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I'm laughing about that because we just got into property management, and so I'm getting the calls for people, and so it's just kind of funny, some of the stuff that pops up that you would never expect unless you're renting a house, right? And so
absolutely.
So you also made a comment about being house poor, man. So, like, we haven't scripted this, but you're doing an awesome job of just taking me into, like, the next thing that I want to talk
sure.
about. Great. So before we talk about things to do for people, right? Because doing things is always more important than, what you do is typically the most important thing, right? But I'm also curious, like, what not to do, right? So there's a lot of advice out there right now around, all these boomers, right, talking to us younger people, whatever generation you are, about, oh, you can't afford your house because of that, Starbucks latte every morning, right? Or you're spending too much on experiences, right? And so, like, that's why you don't have any money for down payments. But at the end of the day, like, affordability across has gotten a lot worse over the last 40 years. And so
absolutely,
it's not always just the latte, right? Because I remember there were parents 40 years ago buying primary, a rental property, or their lake house, 3 cars, 5 kids on one income, and like, you couldn't even imagine that right now. So what are some things right now that if you're thinking about doing something that you would just say, absolutely do not do that? Or if you're doing it right now, stop doing it, before we kind of talk about the stuff to do, if that makes sense.
Sure. I think the thing that gets us all probably the most in trouble is going to be larger fixed payments on debt that is not building your net worth.
Okay.
And by that, I mean financing vacations, financing vehicles. I mean, it seems straightforward, but if it's money that you don't have for things that you actually can't afford, that's what gets you in the most trouble. And when you're financing it, then you're building in a fixed monthly payment that if you ever have to tighten your belt and things get tough economically, if you get laid off, if you have, God forbid, an emergency room visit or a long stay at a hospital, something that's very expensive and
Mm-hmm.
unforeseen, um, then you're in big trouble, right? And that
Yeah.
can happen really quick, and that's usually what gets people. Is you have one thing that you could have controlled, and then you have a string of things that were out of your control, and all of a sudden you're in a lot deeper debt than you ever anticipated to be. And not only can you not save up a chunk to put down on a house, you got to get yourself out of this hole now, right? So I think I think being responsible with that, and being realistic about whatever your income is, it really doesn't necessarily always matter how much income you have. I've seen people spend it all, right?
Yeah.
It's not hard to spend it all. So is it important having a higher income when you're trying to qualify for, things that are good debt, which are backed by positive and hopefully appreciating assets like houses, like a bunch of other things? Debt isn't necessarily a bad thing, but irresponsible debt is, right? So that's usually what gets people in the most trouble. And now you're seeing a lot higher balances on things like credit cards too, right? So if you're that's what we're talking about, financing vacations and things like that. People are putting it on their credit cards, and then they don't realize, oh, that's a 20 to 30% interest rate. Uh, Yikes,
Yeah.
right? if,
Yeah.
if any investment manager could guarantee a 20 or 30% interest rate, you'd say, where do I sign?
Yeah, no, absolutely, right. And you make an interesting point about car payments, right? Because you see a lot of people who are spending $750, $1,000 a month on their car payment because they can
Yeah,
afford it, right? And it's not often that you're talking about like how that impacts debt to income ratios, right? So if you're, let's say, getting underwritten for 40% debt to income ratio, which is within Fannie and Freddie guidelines, right?
sure.
Then that $1,000 payment really goes toward effectively what, like 2,500 a month kind of thing in mortgage payment qualification. Is that math right? So like
Yeah, yeah,
if you eliminate that car payment, you could afford to spend so much more kind of thing on a house. Yeah, maybe you're not driving around in your brand new Ford Raptor, but like you can get a really nice used car for 20, 25 grand. And maybe you end up financing a little bit more on your home. But since there's a much cheaper interest rate over a longer term, you can basically take that cash, get a used car, and you're basically in a much better spot anyway, because your used
yeah,
car won't appreciate as quickly. And at least you now own a house, right?
yeah, exactly. And it's not complicated things, but this is why it's good to have a professional who lives in the space in whatever aspect, whether you need help with taxes, you need help with financial planning, with buying a house, managing a house, whatever. Um, it's important to talk to the people who eat and breathe it.
And are there opportunities? So like, let's say you've accumulated a bunch of this credit card debt, right? And or whatever, or maybe student loan debt. I don't really know I'm not really sure where the interest rates on that stuff is right now, but like,
Yeah,
um, but you still want to buy, you still want to do all this stuff. Is there a way to? And I don't want to get you in trouble with anyone, so please say whatever you're comfortable with.
sure.
But like, is there a way to consolidate that in some way, shape, or form with a mortgage, or get that all paid off, or is there a way to structure all this, assuming that you could qualify and just make it easier for people, or is that not really an option? You really need to kind of take it one step at a time before you buy.
It would be totally on a case by case basis.
Okay,
There are options a lot of the time to bundle and potentially save and refinance a bunch, whatever kind of personal debt you might have. And that really depends on what kind of interest rate environment we're in at the time too, to see if you could even get a lower rate,
got
and if the monthly payments would actually go down at that point in time. So it's always worth a look,
yeah.
but it very much depends on the individual and the current environment.
So this is the plug to call someone like Michael and also work with a really good mortgage team right before you're looking to buy, and maybe do it a few months in advance, right? So that way, if you need to restructure or do some stuff or improve your credit or pay off something, you're not putting good money after bad, and you're doing the right things you need to do in order to get where you need to go, right? So, all right. So
Exactly.
I appreciate all that in terms of what not to do, right? So don't finance vacations on credit cards. Seems like a very reasonable thing, right? Don't overspend on brand new cars, boats,
Yes.
boats especially, right? So what are some things that people could do, right? I mean, life is more expensive. We're probably, the average millennial, Gen Z, Gen X consumer is probably not able to save as much potentially as they were a decade ago in the same
Yeah.
role. And so, like, what are some things that people could do right now that you think there's easy fixes or maybe easy habits to change that could help them maybe afford more or get into a home faster?
Yeah, I think for the long haul, the best thing you can build no matter what stage you're at is first and foremost going to be your credit and increasing the credit score. So that's just being responsible with the fixed payments you already have now, the credit and debt that you already have now,
Mm-hmm.
and making sure if you can make it automatic payments and make sure that that never falls through the cracks, that's an easy checkbox to have. And that one really just takes time a lot of the time to increase. You can get some quicker bumps off the bat
Mm-hmm.
by improving a few things, but if you're doing that from a long-term standpoint, it's just going to really help you throughout your life, right?
Sure.
It's just a necessity at this point. It will be important to save, and a lot of times that's going to be easier said than done. Because it's going to be based on, okay, I do have to have a place to live now. I have to buy groceries. I have to, and I'm going to live a little, right? I can't just say no to everything, and that's totally reasonable. I understand that, right? I've been through
Mm-hmm.
that myself. So maybe there's different aspects that you could look for potential other income streams, or maybe taking a look at your current career and seeing is there an opportunity to have some kind of income bump in the next few years, right?
Totally.
What steps do I take? And just being conscious of that career path, right? And what you want. And it's not all going to be monetary, but it does play into the picture for sure, and it is important. Outside of that, I think, like you said, to your point, if you have less debt that you're committed to, whether that's student loans, cars, boats, anything like that, if you can really limit that, one, that's less money going out every month that instead of going towards debt, you could put towards savings for a down payment or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But it also helps you qualify for more house, right? So it's just, the biggest things you can do is increase your income, you can decrease your debt and committed monthly payments, and you can better your credit score. That's the big three,
Yeah.
right? So if you're focused on those and really cognizant of the decisions you're making, you'll get there sooner than you think, right? And if it takes 3 or 4 years or longer, that's what it takes, and that's okay, right?
Yeah.
Time can be on your side on those three things.
Absolutely. And in terms of budgeting, like, is that an exercise you typically take your clients through? Or you'd mentioned that you've had experience with people spending as much money as they possibly can just because it comes in, they
Yes.
spend it. Like, how important is budgeting? Or, as you were kind of talking, I was thinking about this $1,000 car payment and how many dinners that would otherwise buy, especially with
Sure.
significant other, right? So you're like, okay, well, maybe the moral of the story is if you can't really have it all anymore, right? If everything is more expensive, so you're going to have to make some decision. But in theory, you could save money if you eliminated $1,000 a month car payment. You could
Yeah.
still get those 3 or 4 dinners a month and basically come out break even, right? I mean,
Sure.
is that like, are those exercises that you take your clients through and stuff, and like conversations that you have with people?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's where you have to start, because most people have no idea what's coming in or what's going out, right?
Yeah,
And it's just like counting calories, right? Nobody wants to do it, but it's the place to start. And maybe that's not, I know there's all kinds of diets where you're not talking about it, but it's still a good metaphor. But yeah, it's good to see, and a lot of times it's eye-opening, and you can see, okay, here's what's going towards housing, here's what's going, I had no idea I was just spending this much on Amazon and our miscellaneous spending category.
right.
I didn't realize I'm eating out this much. I didn't realize I have a take home of $3,000 a month, and 600 of that's going towards a car, right? And then rent's another 2,000, right? And that's like, wow, I've got hardly anything left over. So those are kind of situations where it can feel real tight on the budget and be very stressful very quickly. And with a thin margin, that's where you inadvertently are going to build up, toxic credit card debt, right? You may not even know it. And all of a sudden you look at the balance and you're like, oh, well, there's not enough cash in my checking account. or savings to pay the balance. And so you just carry a balance
Right.
from then on, right? So you have to start with the budget. Eventually you build these better habits. You don't necessarily have to just like stick to it to a T, because some months are going to be more expensive. You might have to replace the tires on your car and you weren't expecting that, right? But that's not going to be every month, right? So you go based off the averages. Some are going to be higher, some are going to be lower, and that's okay. But when we're looking at it from a longer period of time, over a year or years, how is that stacking up? And are there certain areas that we can change these habits? And if these long-term goals are very important to you for saving, then you'll make the changes.
Yeah.
And if not, then you don't make the changes.
Yeah. It all comes down to motivation, right?
Yeah,
Like you can lead a horse to water, but forcing it to drink is a whole other issue, right? So, dude, I really appreciate all this, and I love your advice, because it's just it's just middle of the fairway, classic advice. You're not suggesting anything too radical. You're not saying that anything really needs to change, like anything major needs to change. You just need to evaluate your goals and make sure that your financial habits align with whatever your long-term goals are, right? So,
absolutely.
Okay, so I guess this is my last question. I'm just going to open up to you, like, if you were going to give advice, or like if I just want to like open it up to you for someone in this position, right? Whether they're thinking about buying or selling their first home, they're thinking about buying, you may be looking at their first real estate investment. Maybe they're thinking about selling, but they're just worried about where they're going to live after they sell in this higher rate environment. I guess what would be just one general piece of advice, or something you'd want to think about, or maybe you are thinking about it, as you're talking to your clients right now?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, it's going to depend always on the circumstances for the individuals. But if you're looking to buy, if you're looking to sell, again, it's really hard to time, right? Nobody ever gets the timing right. So I think there should be less of an emphasis on that and
Mm-hmm.
more on, is this a life goal of mine, right? Are we happy in the house we currently have? Or if you're looking and it's a major goal of yours to own a home, well, then look at it seriously and break it down and see what the different options are to make that affordable and reasonable, right? Because there is a lot of flexibility, and a lot of times there's options, and people don't really realize that they could lean on maybe parents or other family members to get that kind of assistance. Like a lot of times the family does want to help out, right? You could have a co-signer. It can be a big thing to ask, but you don't know until you ask,
Right.
right?
Right.
And there's different ways to structure it on the loan side, which obviously is not my world, but in these different environments, when it's harder to sell right now, well, that can be pretty advantageous for the buyer, right? It's the first
Right.
time in a while that I'm sure you've seen you can actually ask for things as a buyer, right?
Ask for a lot.
Yeah,
In certain situations. Yeah, for sure.
yeah. And I think as a seller, it's just managing your expectations that it's not always going to be a world through rose-colored lenses, right? It's
Right.
it's going to be what it's going to be, right? And we do have pullbacks in all markets and in all asset classes, and we have good years in all of those same asset classes and markets, right? So I think if you want to move and you need to move, you move.
Yeah.
If you want to turn it into an investment property because you have the cash flow to do so, that's another option if you want to buy some time, right? It
Yeah.
totally depends on what cards you have to play with in that given moment, right? And what kind of risk you want to take as an investor.
Love it, man. So if someone wanted to get a hold of you and talk a little bit more, what would be the best way for someone to reach you?
Best way is looking me up on my website. If you check me out, Michael.Cates, UBS, if you just Google that, I'll pop up. Feel free to email me. I've got my contact information on there as well if you want to give me a call too. So always open to consultations, and just I enjoy getting people on the right foot and off on the right start. So always happy to chat.
Awesome, man. Well, hey, thank you very much for taking the time out of your morning. I really appreciate it. And look Michael up. He's a great dude if you have any questions. So thank you very much, bud. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jared. Appreciate it.